to the third webinar of a series of 8 for the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online Adaptation Communities of Practice. And those are run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, and we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 45 minutes. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have some time left over for any questions that you might have for the presenter. So if you do have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. And before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted. And the reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions, feedback, etc. during the webinar. So to ask a question during the Q&A session, all you'll have to do is dial *6 and that will unmute your line. But please do keep them muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for the presenter during the question and answer period. As well, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can also use this chat area to type out your message, or you can click on my name and you can send me a private message, and then I can try to help you as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, and I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to all of those who have pre-registered with me, and we'll also be posting it to the Forestry Community of Practice website. And finally, I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACOP, is. So I wanted to take this opportunity just to quickly mention that it's an interactive online community, and it's dedicated to those who are working in forestry or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. It includes features such as news articles, events, a library full of resources, discussion forums, and much more. And it's free to join, so if there's anyone on the line today who's interested in learning more about the FACOP, please just click on the link in the chat box for more information and to register. So with that being said, we're very excited to have Dr. Jim MacLellan on the line with us today to talk about climate forest impact assessments, scaling from the national to the regional and back again. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Jim is a decision analyst who specializes in environmental issues. He has worked in various institutions, including the University of New Brunswick, the University of British Columbia, the University of Applied Sciences at Eberswalde, Germany, Environment Canada, the University of Toronto, as well as York University. Jim has an extensive background in ecology, sociology, and economics, as well as experience with an array of analytical techniques, which he uses to support his research and application in environmental decision-making, climate change adaptation planning, and institutional capacity building. He has taught, lectured, and guest lectured internationally and throughout Canada, focusing on the practical application of knowledge and techniques, and his work experience has also included fighting forest fires and brokering securities in the Government of Canada bond market. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Jim, for taking the time to present this webinar for us today. It's very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Annette. Much appreciated. And before I get going, I'd really like to thank some people who have been instrumental in sort of pulling some of the stuff together that we've been working on, including Kelvin Hirsch, Jason Edwards, Captain State Marie, but also the people in New Brunswick, Van Lance, and the people at the Climate Secretariat, and a whole host of other people. So thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. So today we're actually going to be talking about a little bit of a process. I was quite happily pulled in, really, to New Brunswick to start to augment some of the climate change adaptation capacity. And, you know, one of the first things we notice, as in a lot of sectors, and the recent national reassessment will sort of testify to this, one of these things is how, you know, the whole application thing has been, in some respects, not as robust as we'd like it to be. So the question is, how do you actually get some interest going in terms of climate change adaptation, especially in terms of different sectors? And I'm responsible for right across the board, whether it be, you know, agriculture or forestry or sea level rise or any of these factors. But forestry is actually, I am a forester, and so obviously it holds something close to me, but all the more reason why I stayed away from it a little bit until more recently, because, you know, you can just start focusing on it. So one of the things we started talking about, we did this broad sort of perspective. We were trying to understand how these relationships, how to form these relationships between regional capacity and national capacity and even international capacity. So one of the first problems, and this, I apologize for this slide. This is very much a slide like I would present to my students, but nevertheless, I do teach, so I'm gonna pass it by. I didn't try to make it look any better, but one of the first premises is the fact that we don't have perfect knowledge, and knowledge is fragmented, and it's in different places. But the corollary, the flip side of that, is that we actually have a heterogeneous mix of experts and resources in terms of our ability to produce knowledge, but also, importantly, in terms of our ability to interpret knowledge. So this is actually quite critical when you're actually trying to bring climate change adaptation to the regional or local level. You know, in New Brunswick, for example, we don't have a lot of climate modeling capacity. So, of course, the idea is you go look outside your borders. But you also need people who can actually interpret what climate modelers are giving us. So this is actually fundamental. So Hayek makes this point. He's an economist. And the idea is, how do you pull all these elements together? Because no one actually has all the pieces. Well, interestingly enough, I did a little further reading in Hayek, and a lot of us who have an economics background or decision analysis are very comfortable with this idea that knowledge itself can be valued, like knowledge is relevant to the decision or relevant to the end goal. But Hayek was actually responding to something quite interesting in the 40s. And this was the notion that you could actually, through centralized planning, bring all these elements together. And Hayek was, vehemently against that. He said, no, it's only the market that can actually evaluate the importance of different forms of knowledge. And that, in fact, this is such a complex decision, it can only be done in that way. Well, what we realize now is that there are many places where there is not a market to actually do this for us. So climate change is actually a very, very good example. We don't have a market for climate. We may have a market for carbon, but we don't have a market for climate. We don't have a market for generally biodiversity and many of these ecosystem services. In fact, we wouldn't even know about climate change if we didn't have that sort of creative aspect to science and that curiosity-driven science. So there are certainly parts of the equation where we don't have that ability to go to the market to tell us what to do. So what are the alternatives? Well, one of the alternatives, of course, is then we'll go ask scientists. Scientists kind of know what they're doing. Well, more recently, you can go both ways on this. One is that, yes, science is a great producer of knowledge, but it can be highly fragmented. And this is something I pulled out of PLOS, so I guess it's fully, I can put it up on as a slide. And the idea here is it's looking at the sort of silos of science and the different forms and types of science and how they produce knowledge. And one of the results here, of course, is that we actually do have silos. They do produce different types of knowledge, and it's rather difficult to get them to talk to each other. So I've been thinking about this whole question of knowledge specialization. We talked about it, knowledge reduction. And the idea here is, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the idea is that, science actually pulls things and fragments it, reductionism, and then is able to create, very informed knowledge about particular issues, whether it's within these silos, within these disciplines, whether it's about cell biology, whether it's about economics, whether it's about all these different forms of knowledge. But specialization has its advantages, but we also implicitly realize that at some point we have to pull these elements together. And we saw this in the late 90s, the whole question of holism and the whole question of, we need holistic arguments for environmental problems. Climate modelers are actually very good at this. They realize they can't just have one component of the climate. They actually need to model and address all the different components. So there's this constant tension between being very good at one particular thing, but then pulling it all together. So this is a great paper. And it talks specifically about knowledge specialization and knowledge brokering. And it does so in the context of, in this case, technological innovation. So it uses patents as a really nice data set, and it tries to look at it. It makes the point that, in fact, we have to move back and forth between knowledge specialization and knowledge brokerage. And it sets up an interesting model to be able to look at this. And fundamentally, it says that you have different knowledge domains or different places where we have innovation, A, B, C. And it starts to try and look at, because this patent information is structured so well, it tries to look at the relationships between these different knowledge domains. That's actually quite interesting. So they make the point that, in fact, we're looking at two different points on a spectrum in terms of, yes, reductionism has its efficiency, but knowledge brokerage, or at that moment where you pull all these different elements of knowledge together, actually is a better vehicle for knowledge growth under certain circumstances. But it is far riskier than knowledge specialization. So here's the notion that if you specialize, you do what you're supposed to, you do what is highly recognized within your field, you're probably safe. And you're moving knowledge ahead in Kuhn's sense in an incremental fashion. But every once in a while, you have to dip into that whole thing of pulling different ideas together. And this is sort of a framework, and hopefully we'll get back to it, to start to think about how do we go from a national assessment to a regional assessment? Because it's not just a matter of saying, oh, we'll do a national assessment, oh, we'll do a regional assessment. And I myself thought it was that simple. But, our workshop and some of the work we've done have found it to be far more complex. But the literature actually supports the fact that it is complex, but the rewards are quite large. So in this sense, I'm actually quite impressed with what the CFS has been doing at a national scale. So knowledge brokering. Knowledge brokering requires that you give people a common intellectual language or goal-oriented perspective. We argue that this rarely occurs at the academic scale, with the majority advancement resulting from large international initiatives, and of course we're thinking IPCC. Should we embed ourselves in these initiatives given the size of our research? There's all sorts of questions here. The IPCC, it tends to be in the background now. We take it for granted, and I'm sure many graduate students have just always been exposed to it. But it's actually very important to look at some of these larger assessment processes, millennium development, millennium assessment, this sort of thing, and realize, wow, so where is the big advances occurring in terms of knowledge creation from our research community? So this is actually quite interesting, because what it implies is that, in fact, we are looking at things that are actually quite important in terms of not only the different knowledge domains, but the ability to speak between these different domains. So get rid of that. And so, in this sense, what can some of these larger, what can we learn about this in terms of knowledge? Well, it was part of an analysis looking at the state of research in terms of climate change adaptation, and this is the NRCan reassessment report. And one of the things we found is that if you actually look at, so this is some interesting stuff. So if you are going up, if you're trying to get a sense of what's going on in Canada, we did this analysis, and in a sense what we were looking at was the publications of researchers within Canada. And what we found in this broad scale, and that's how it's meant to be used in a broad scale, we found that in the previous assessment period, that forestry was like third or fourth in terms of overall amount of publications produced. So, we take that as a measure of what's going on. But in the recent period, I think from 2005, forestry actually has the most publications going on. But forestry seems to have moved from a sort of a climate change mitigation perspective to a climate change adaptation perspective. And actually, that's quite, from our perspective, that's actually very interesting for all sorts of reasons, least of which is the fact that forestry has long been one of those disciplines that integrate among the various different components. And so we took that data and we said, well, that's interesting. If we go back, it's like, that's quite nice. So there's a lot going on in forest, whatever. So if you actually then start to pick it apart a little further, and you're trying to get a sense of what they're doing in forestry. So one of the things we did was we said, well, we did a sort of a categorization way back when I was at UBC with John Ennis, and we were looking at, just fundamental categorizations of, what different researchers do. And the empirical stuff in terms of descriptive data, the predictive modeling in terms of growth and yield, but also in terms of landscape effects, landscape ecology, lots of things of that nature. And then the final component is sort of a decision framework. And we call it vetting simply because in reality, when we're using scenarios or when we're actually doing decision making, we're actually ignoring a whole lot of information. We've already focused in or framed the problem. And so there's almost an infinite realm of possibilities that we just ignore. And we just focus in on. So we tend to see things in terms of functionally, we can actually look at the literature in this functional sense. It's kind of arbitrary, but what we do find is that the literature actually lines up in this way quite nicely. So then, in fact, the different disciplines are often producing, empirical results or doing predictive modeling or projection. And we have another component, a huge component, that looks at decision making and how that's done. So if we actually look at the data from the bibliometric analysis in that way, what we find is that we have these different categorizations where, there's a chunk of people working on creating knowledge at a very fundamental level, and where, we typically think of species, we think of all sorts of things, genetics, evolutionary biology, what have you. And there's a whole bunch of people more recently working on predictive modeling, growth and yield modeling, economic modeling, sociological modeling, anything that sort of gives some sense of the future. And then there's another smaller component of people who are actually working on actually pulling those elements together in a decision framework. And finally, as academics, there's a whole bunch of people talking about the whole thing. Theoretical sort of things, and and this shouldn't be surprising. Actually, at first I was a little bit surprised. Like, wow, there's a lot of people talking about how we should pull all these different elements together, and I wonder why that is. Well, you only get published if you're actually producing more generic or general insight. So you're often discussing these larger issues, and I think that that's obviously a good thing. If we actually, though, then, because paper, let's say, can belong to one or two categories. If you actually start looking at an individual paper, and you can see that some of them talk both about data and modeling, and some of them talk both about, in the sense of prediction. They'll talk about data, of course, they'll talk about modeling, but they'll also talk about decision analysis, they'll also talk about how the whole thing fits together. Not on the data side. It's quite clear if data and modeling don't really talk about decision analysis. And then the decision analysts, those people who do, let's say, optimization, cost benefit, that sort of thing, they don't really talk about data. They don't really talk about empirical relationships. Give me your data, let me go figure things out. And then in the final category, again, typically, you would assume that those talking at that meta-analysis would actually talk a lot about data and these other things, but they kind of don't. They talk mostly about talking about the big picture. And so that's kind of insightful, and then we can start, looking at this in another way. If we look at integration as a component, well, in terms of most categories, most people talk about integration at some level. Not a lot, but at some level. And certainly on the meta side, it's a huge component of what they're discussing. How do you integrate across these different disciplines, across these functional categories in a decision framework? How do you do that? Well, what's interesting is, and that makes sense, and that's a really good thing. So it seems to lend itself towards what we were trying to do in terms of, how do you go from what is an assessment, a national assessment? What is a regional assessment? Who do you talk to? These are big questions. And so let's go to the literature. But what we find is, when I actually look at the papers, and this is very important, you categorize it, but then you start reading the papers. Of course, you've been doing this all along, but you look at it. There's only 2 or 3 papers who actually, 2 or 3 instances where you actually go in and really try to pull together a case study and integrate all these different elements. So a lot of people are talking about it, but to actually pull it all together is rather difficult to do. We also found out that there's not a lot of people doing economic analysis, actual economic analysis as well. So these are broad. This is the basis of looking at research papers and trying to get something out of it in that. So, the implications are, we should not necessarily expect a comprehensive integrative exercise from academics. Rather, these exercises typically are undertaken by governments and international agencies. And, the IPCC, of course, the poster child, but Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, Natural Resources Canada, and Canadian Forestry Service. Now, this should sound obvious, and certainly it rings true. But for myself, if you're trying to come at it from the bottom and get to that point, you start to realize as you're doing this, it's like, well, academics, of course, they don't have the resources to pull all these elements together. And of course, the IPCC is quite novel, and it's done a huge amount to give us a common language and to do, this huge assessment report, which of course, the synthesis report just came out. And science now is really strongly impacted by these large exercises, which are giving us languages, but are also sort of structuring how we do things. Because if you're not in that game, it begs the question, how are you not responding to that game? How relevant is your research? So of course the IPCC, we see this, but not to despair, because if we actually look, so if we're not all involved with the IPCC, or that we're trying to emulate it, if we go back, if I've gone back to the first reports, they're actually quite simple. So in terms of, so here we have the 5 climate change adaptation working group 2s, and what does it say about forests? And typically, so this is the first report. Typically, what you find in the first report is quite vague, but is sort of on the mark. These are the issues that we would be interested in. What's different between the first and, say, AR7 would be that, in fact, it starts to flush things out. Interestingly enough, so it's been a process for them as well. Interestingly enough, if you do a word content analysis on forests and on biodiversity, the actual specifics of forests, they had a whole they didn't have a chapter in this recent working group 2. There hasn't been a focus there at all. And biodiversity's sort of been there a little bit. And things seems to have changed a little bit in terms of what they're focusing on. So this sort of raises questions. If we're interested in the forest, say we're in forestry or we're interested in the forest sector, the IPCC's given us a very powerful language. But if we go to them for the answers, I'm not sure we can do that at a national or regional scale. Also, if we actually look at Canada's overall participation within that process, it seems to have been declining over the years. I'm not saying it is, but I did a content analysis just on different national references within all the reports, and it's not a big deal, and you can overinterpret these things. But then I compared it to some easily identified countries that might be similar in terms of what they might be doing within the IPCC process, and Australia's just gone, improved quite a bit, but we ourselves are, not doing as much. There's generally been a decrease overall in terms of national input, and some of the topics have changed dramatically. But, this raises some interesting questions. And if we go back to this whole knowledge specialization, knowledge brokerage, this model, if we're using is just to structure the process that we're looking at. And we're sort of saying, well, maybe we're swinging back more towards knowledge specialization. Maybe we're swinging back toward these national studies. Maybe, our involvement with IPCC, maybe we've got a lot out of it. Maybe it's time to start focusing in on it. I don't know. I'm not sure. And I said, I'm not married to this framework. It's just a way of trying to understand what's going on. So what about Canada? Well, we have the IPCC process, and then we have 2 really, I thought, quite influential studies. So this is the 2007-2008 report with Lemon Study Impact. So this is the NRCan report. And part of that NRCan report, of course, is climate change in Canada's forest. And that's my go-to when I was working in the broad sense, in terms of what was going on in Canada's forest, I would go to this. And part of the reason I pulled all this together is my American colleagues were doing an assessment, and they're like, so what's going on in Canada? And I'm like, oh, I better look. And sure enough, talked to some good friends, and they were happy to help me, people like Calvin Hirsch and that, and let me know what's going on in Canada. So I'm not saying I actually know what's going on, but I am saying these are some of the touchstones that I go to. So the process seems to have gone from that first assessment report to a really interesting study here in terms of vulnerability of Canada's tree species, and another mitigation study, and that's phase 1. And then, so we'll talk about the vulnerability study. But then also, you can barely see it here, but there was a national roundtable study, which the forest sector was a big component of that. And actually, I was on a working committee for the national roundtable, and that was one of the best done pieces of work, I would honestly say, of the sectors that we looked at. And then, of course, there's phase 2, and phase 2 has a vulnerability study in terms of Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, I should say. And there's all these different components. So what am I saying? I'm saying if we actually go to academic, it can be highly fragmented. And if we though in this case go to this integrating body, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers or CFS, there's this this function that they're serving to actually start to pull all these elements together. So I'm highly impressed in terms of what's been going on, not just in the sense of forestry, but overall, because I've been doing these studies right across the board. So, how do we then, if you're in the Atlantic region or any other region, link yourself into this process? And maybe some provinces aren't. Maybe some provinces link directly into the IPC process. It's an interesting sort of game where you actually try to figure out how do you get the information you need from this, but then how also do you inform this process? So multiple knowledge perspectives. So in this case, now here's an interesting thing. Talk about a catalytic sort of event. The study on vulnerability of Canada's tree species to climate change actually caused a little bit of a stir in New Brunswick. And what this came out of was one of the local NGOs picked up a reference within the vulnerability study that said balsam fir would probably be extirpated from New Brunswick forest. And so the Moncton Free Press picked this up, CBC Radio picked this up, and my colleague at the government of New Brunswick came to me and asked me to start looking at this. So how do you look at an issue like this? So here's balsam fir likely to disappear in New Brunswick forest, and there it is again. So it's a simple question. Will balsam fir disappear from New Brunswick forest? But as we know, that's asking those simple questions. I mean, it's a simple question, but it really is catalytic, because the idea is that, wow, who do we go to answer this question? So the first place you go to is just to talk to the people who wrote the report. Of course, we did that, Mark Johnson, but also Mark Johnson worked heavily with David Price, and you start to pull this thing together, and you're like, oh, okay, so I see where they've gone with this. And it then became a real interesting sort of catalyst for our first workshop. So our first workshop, we actually, and the literature supports this, we actually give a broad brushstroke. So go out and consult with, some of the best people that you know to start looking at this question. It's sort of this broad brushstroke. Who do we ask? Who do we talk to? How do you even start pulling this thing apart? And, so in this case, one of the first things that you do is, who do you know? And this was one of the things that we did at the Universal Climate Change Research Collaborative. We did an expert mapping of New Brunswick, and not just New Brunswick, but the whole Atlantic region in terms of forest and in terms of that knowledge. And the people in red were the people we identified. I should actually have one for Dan Curran, but I walked down the hallway and I talked. So, it's hardly count identifying through an expert mapping. But I didn't know Les Winar was here. I didn't know Colin LaRocque was in Mount Allison. Charles Burke I knew, but I didn't really, I knew him as a friend, but I didn't really know of his work. And then you start to build this package. And in this case, you can see we augmented it with Philippe Gachon. We augmented it with Don Baisden in terms of invasive species, Mike Watt, and Dan Quering. And we start to ask these broader questions. And I think it was quite powerful, because the idea is, how do you frame this problem? So Les Winar gave us some really fantastic insight about whether temperature alone can cause a dramatic shift in composition. And the answer is yes. And this is original new research within the year that he did the presentation. And it's like, wow, this is pretty powerful. You can have a dramatic shift in temperature, and then a dramatic shift, in this case, hemlock, just disappear. And that can happen over a 5 to 10 year period. That was actually just quite profound for, I think, a lot of us. Colin LaRocque did more the shorter, like in that interim term, up to 400 years, 500 years. Brilliant data set. And he was looking at balsam fir as well, tying it to the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is really, really interesting. Because, yes, there's that very strong linkage. Les's work, Les is actually known for his climate work, Les Winar, and this really intimate linkage between what's going on in this field and what's going on in the climate change modeling field. And of course, if you know the literature, you know that that's going on. But to actually have some people here within New Brunswick, it was actually quite profound. And so we went on to Philippe Gachon, who had done a really interesting analysis with dendrochronological data, but he also started talking to us about storm traps. Now, one of the key things in the Atlantic region was exactly this, that we're interested in storms. We just seem to be obsessed with weather. And it's kind of funny, because Annette was just asking me what the weather's like in Toronto. Well, it's a really big issue on the coast. So Philippe was talking to us about those sort of things, and being a regional climate modeler, was trying to give us a sense of why the Atlantic is so important. And then we talked, of course, to Charles Burke, who actually has this sort of hybrid model, and was also, his model sort of supports the model that used for, or the different models used for the vulnerability assessment of species. And yes, absolutely, balsam fir disappears. You're like, oh, so a picture is being painted. Don Baisley talked about invasive species. Mike Watton, I'm still interested in fire, used to fight forest fires. But, interesting question. Will climate change create conditions that, would be conducive to fire or an increase in fire? And we know we have had very severe events of fire within the Atlantic region. And Mike is saying, well, I can't tell you about the climate modeling, but I can tell you that your fuel loadings are such that, wow, if you did have fires, all the conditions are right for big fires. And then Dan Quering came in at the end. And Dan is an entomologist, for those who don't know, and Dan started talking about the complexity of the issue and temperature. And we'll touch back on this. So we had a really interesting workshop, and what we found is that macro-scale modeling is great, but it must be augmented by microscale modeling, exercises, and expert interpretation. So it's as important who you choose within your region to interpret the results of these macroscale exercises as it is the information itself. And this is critical. And it's critical not only to predict ideal species, but to contextualize this information within the political framework or the policy framework of New Brunswick in this. So this was our first workshop. And we were like, maybe that's about it. Maybe that's as far as it goes. Well, starting to talk to colleagues at CFS, in particular, I was talking to Anthony Taylor, and we were like, it would be nice to actually, have a larger assessment, because this workshop did generate a little bit of interest. It's like, well, what are we doing in terms of climate change on the Atlantic coast? And that's when a person from Ontario starts to see that, oh, it sort of happens a little bit differently out here. We have different provinces, we have different priorities. Maybe people are interested in this. So we start talking around the Atlantic region, and sure enough, people are. And from Anthony, I think we found out that the federal government's doing a national assessment. And so it's like, oh, well, certainly we would be very interested in seeing how those two sort of relate. So we put on a second workshop. And the second workshop, we used the scheme that was derived, and we'll get back to this, but we used the scheme that was derived from the participants. So in this case, we had the climate change projections feeding into disturbance and extreme weather, feeding into forest composition, productivity, feeding into timber supply, forest interest. There's a relationship between all these different elements. And we thought, hey, it would be really interesting, given the fact that, our analysis seemed to suggest that we had expertise in the Atlantic region, but that it was sort of fragmented all over the place. And then to actually be able to tie into a national assessment, that would be brilliant. But we also knew from our first workshop that, in fact, unless you do tie it in, you're just going to lose your audience. And so what we did was we paired these different, we paired national focus with regional focus. And in the first case, we look at Philippe Gachon and David Price, and, and actually if we, hold on, let's do we go next. If we start to look at it, we created the workshop. Brian Eddy, Richard Parfait are responsible for the national assessment. And if we actually pull this thing together, if we start to do this pairing, we actually might start to get really interesting results. So very specifically, how do you go from a national to a regional assessment, and of course then back up to a national assessment? That was the idea. So we held a workshop last February, and it seemed, all we have to do is agree upon models, and it's not a big deal. So in this case, if we actually start going through some of the results, and I've been going through these results, trying to figure out how to pull this thing together. As I said, I think I have a framework now in terms of some of the theoretical sort of structure that I would sort of pin this onto. So I have to get back to my colleagues. But, what we found out was, first off, how did we even get to this point? And that's interesting in and of itself, because Brian Eddy was our introductory speaker, and, at a point in the future, I'll have a point list of this. But it was interesting that the Forest Change Integrated Assessment, so this national assessment, was actually, part of the National Adaptation Program, and it's meant to inform federal policy. So it's a very specific thing. And before they even started doing this, they did a really dramatic thing, which doesn't sound dramatic at all. They talked to policy people, and they talked to senior management. And they said, well, what do you know? What should we do? And they generated through this process 178 questions that policy and senior management want answered in terms of a national climate change adaptation assessment on the forest sector. They whittled that down to 39 questions, and they ended up with 5 major questions. And the questions, if I have it right, are how the forest will change overall, the effect of climate change on disturbance regimes, the effect of climate change on productivity and composition, the impact on timber supply, and which, so in a sense of prioritizing which forest ecosystems and which communities, and who's vulnerable and this sort of thing. So it became a very focused approach, and no apologies, and nor should there be. It's like this was meant to inform federal policy. And so if we're in the region, in the Atlantic region, they were like, we'd be happy to work with you and we'd be happy to share data, but this is very focused, and as it should be. And so, the process went on and they adopted the IPCC vulnerability assessment framework. So again, even here, this very notion of an assessment is being harmonized with a larger scale, as it should be, to have that harmonization so that everyone's linked into the same language, everyone's coming at it from in this case, in a sort of an integrated way. And so this was actually quite, having Brian do the introduction was actually quite informative. And then you can see how this whole thing was actually created. So then if we go back to the framework again, our first 2 speakers were David Price, who's been integral in a lot of these things, and this is on the climate side. And so we got certainly interesting results from David, and he reminded us of some of the things that we sort of knew, but it's like put it in the perspective of forestry. For example, there's not a lot of difference between the different scenarios, up to about 2040 or 2050. So and this is as someone who's done, harvest scheduling, I myself would be like, oh, you're right. So if there's no difference between these different scenarios, we're looking at something where we're all going to be committed to a 2-degree temperature increase, the Atlantic or across the country, different absolute values. But then after that, the world could look very different, whether we have a high sort of concentration or a low concentration of what's going on, a high temperature increase or a low temperature increase. But what David did is he also started to look at things like, where is the consistency between these models, which is a really great question. So you have all these GCM models, and what are they agreeing upon? And that's a great starting point. And so he starts talking about this, like how do you actually interpret these models from the international community, and what do you get out of it? And I think that's it's a really, really great way to go. He also tried to focus the national assessment in terms of climatically on terrestrial ecozones. And of course, what we know from our first workshop, of course, ecozones are related to climate. It's that strong, intimate relationship, but maybe not perfectly. But I think that's a great way to go forward. So he started talking about, in particular, what we might see in the Atlantic region. And, one of the things that came up again, and this is really reassuring if you actually get these things happening, a couple of people telling you it, a couple of experts telling you it. Storms, storm tracks. What can we expect? More winter storms, more frequent winter storms. And this is actually quite important, of course, also to the forest sector. So in terms of David, we then moved on to Philippe Gachon. Now, Philippe is a regional climate modeler. He has a lot of expertise, very at that level, is involved in the research arm of Environment Canada. And, Philippe is my go-to in terms of trying to understand how all these factors come together, at least in terms of climate change. And what he picked up on, obviously talking to David Price, but what he picked up on again was the storm track. And the fact that in the Atlantic region is very unique in the context of the rest of Canada. So he was, in a sense, establishing the fact that we are looking at an entirely different type of climate that has a very powerful effect coming out of, the Baffin West Atlantic, or Atlantic or Oscillation. In any event, what he's saying is that, in fact, we're looking at a lot more intense storms. We're looking at a highly variable region, much more so than the rest of Canada. And this links in very, very nicely with our first workshop, Philippe, in terms of Les Swinard and in terms of Cullen-Larocque. And there's this sense that there's a lot going on here. And in fact, even recent results, in the research community suggests that a whole lot of energy is being stored in the North Atlantic, and that we're looking at some of the highest, evaporation rates in the world happening off the Atlantic, and we're looking at very dramatic things, to the extent that some people would hypothesize that a lot of the variability that's going on globally is actually centered on the North Atlantic. So this creates a really interesting basis upon which to say, yes, we should probably get the capacity to start doing a regional climate assessment for the forest sector. So if we move on, if we go to disturbance and extreme weather, well, we have an interesting, in this case, all CFS, but we have Sylvie Gauthier and Jan Belanger, who are looking at that national scale. And then we sort of augmented it with David Gray. Dan Quiring's retired, and he suggested David Gray, and it was actually a really great choice. So in terms of Sylvie, she started talking about fire, and of course they're interested in fire, they're interested in disease, insects, disturbance, drought, those sorts of things. But Sylvie talked about fire and the importance of fire, and that there'd be dramatic changes on the North Shore of the St. Lawrence and Labrador. Less so in sort of like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, that sort of thing. But there would be a doubling of the number of fires. So the fires for area burn might not be as great, but there'd be a lot of change in terms of the number of small fires. So that was interesting. Jan started talking about insects. Now, of course, this is a big issue in the Atlantic region. He talked about spruce budworm, and he did a really great introduction in terms of direct and indirect effects and how complex things are. He also talked about mountain biobeetle, and of course this is being done at the national scale. And then how do we deal with this very complex sort of situation? So again, if we then move on to David Gray, he looked at this, and Jan is looking at this at the landscape scale. I think he's using Landis Pro. And David, though, was using an entirely different methodology. And again, I think he used constrained ordination. But David did I thought, a brilliant overview of the complex relationships between fire, climate, spruce budworm, forest composition, the relationship between host and pest, and had, in a very similar way, sort of reinforced what Dan Quiring was telling us, the previous time. So he has more of an empirical statistical approach, but again, major changes. Well, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick will probably be less vulnerable to spruce budworm. So that's interesting. But Dan was also talking to us about woody adulte. So there are other factors that may be involved at some of these scales. Now, if we move on, we're now moving on to species composition and productivity. So Anthony Taylor, representing CFS, started talking to us about, how we actually look at some of these issues. And in fact, it's so complex that, CFS was looking at this over three sort of different scales. They did a fine scale, an intermediate scale, and a coarse scale. So at the fine scale, Anthony's going to be looking at patch models. And at landscape scale, Jan will be doing, I think it's Landis Pro. And then at the larger scale, David Price will be looking at a dynamic global vegetation model. So again, this is actually quite nice because you're looking at trying to get sort of confirmation of what's going on at all those different scales. But also, they're doing an assessment of models. So that's going to be incredibly useful for us in the Atlantic region. If we then move on to Charles Bork, what we see is that, yes, Charles actually has this really nice hybrid model. And so he's been dealing with this thing, spruce budworm, is probably going to be extirpated over the next 100 years from New Brunswick. And he's doing a study right now, in fact, updating that model, and we'll talk about that later. So his methodology actually calculates soil water content. It's sort of done at that sort of macro scale, solar radiant and degree days. And then he augments that with a competition model. He's able to actually account for a lot of variability in terms of what may happen in terms of species composition. And when he augments that with Dan McKinney's results, so what do we see? Balsam fir, black spruce, red spruce, white birch, crumbling aspen, cedar, those ones have probably decreased in the Atlantic region and increase, white pine, white ash, red maple, red oak, and that sort of thing. So we start to get a basis upon which we can actually forward. Now we go to the big one, and the big one was, timber supply. Now, going into this workshop, this is in February, we started to already see that timber supply was becoming the central, sort of like the node the place where everyone was coming to and everyone wanted to talk about timber supply. So we had Fan Rui Meng, who has really great expertise in terms of this and teaches this to his students at UNB Forestry Environmental Management has been doing for years and has been sort of in the background supporting a lot of initiatives in this regard. But we also, talking to some colleagues out in BC, we thought, what about mountain pine beetle? Like, what are they doing in terms of timber supply? It turns out they're doing a lot. That sort of supports what we were looking at in terms of the bibliometric analysis. So we were very, very fortunate to have Carolyn Diamond talk to us about an analysis of the case that they did in terms of looking at timber supply, where they actually used, it was a really interesting thing, because what they were interested in was resilience. And so they were interested in species diversity and how might timber supply be affected by species diversity. So they kind of did this counter, and I didn't really pick up on it until I was going over the notes again. They kind of did this counterfactual thing where they say, well, what would happen if we went back to 1980 and before all the big outbreaks? What would happen if we actually changed the composition of some of these forests? Like, how could we increase the resilience of this forest? And they used a simulation model, and the idea was to remove the high-risk tree species first and then have these sort of mixed species, if I have this right. And they found that, in fact, these more diverse silvicultural approaches ended up in higher value overall, not only in terms of reduced costs, but in terms of the amount of volume that's coming off for us. So this was a really interesting sort of win-win. And I think it highlights the fact that, if you start playing with, some of the climate change impacts, you might be able to identify some of those situations where you're actually improving your situation. And this was a huge surprise for them. And so it was one of those little nuggets or kernels within this workshop. You're like, hey, there are payoffs to be garnered by doing some of these studies and playing with some of these variables and looking at them. So I thought that was actually quite brilliant. Now, we had Carolyn Fan Rui actually did a presentation in terms of timber supply, and just like Professor, he started from the base, and he started talking to us about, fundamentally, where does all this come from? It comes in your growth and yield models. And so he's looking at an empirical approach that would then add in the impact of climate change and then give you the basis upon which to do the timber supply modeling. So that's very solid framework. And of course, he's moving forward on this and had some really interesting results. So that call back to the empirical data, say, hey, let's not, some of this modeling occurs at these different scales, but we've got to get back to that empirical data to be able to try and have a robust idea of what's going on. So I thought that was actually quite important, because you're sort of combining the empirical models with the process-based models. Anyway, after that, let's see if we can move on here. So we go to start talking about forest industry competitiveness. Now, we had a really interesting discussion or presentation by MacLellan, Canadian Forest Service, and she was accounting for local economic particularity. So this was actually really, really interesting. She sort of gives us an overview of, biophysical models, valuation from timber, valuation in terms of end products, or the economic sort of approach. But she's proposing, and the group is proposing, the CFS people, other people within that group, that, a value chain analysis is really the way to go. So if you really want to understand what's going to happen in terms of forest industry competitiveness, you really need to know, where does that fiber go? How is it spread among different mills? How is it affected by spatial constraints and by, quality of timber and that sort of thing? And this would be a bottom-up approach, very fine scale, very robust, bringing you right down to that local level, which could then inform all sorts of things. So she said, we need to go back to ground zero. So they sort of see a reformulation of the objective. What would be the impacts in the forest sector of different fiber inputs? So not just, the profitability, but what if the very nature of fiber and how it's delivered and when it's delivered is affecting many of these changes? Oh, and by the way, how does climate affect those? So a really interesting novel analysis of how you might look at some of these issues. Now, then you go to Dr. Van Lance, UNB, and, Van and his student Thomas were, the center of that in our National Roundtable study. And as I said, I was part of that on one of the committees, and it was actually quite a very nice study. And so we started, there's the introduction and sort of like the reminder, you got to go back to market. You have to start looking at market, and then what's going on, not just in, let's say, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, but your competitors in different parts of the world. And some very, very interesting results that were highlighted the complexity of this issue. So not only this notion that you can look at single sector markets like timber, but if you add in agriculture and infrastructure and some of these other variables, and if you add in, these global markets, you may find that while we may have higher growth rates in the future, let's say, but that trade, international trade, may make you better or worse off. So while you're getting better off, let's say, as temperatures going up, higher productivity, maybe some of your competitors are getting really much better off, and then that way suppress some of the profitability in terms of your market. And so again, what came back again through Dr. Van Lance's analysis was that this is a highly complex thing, but this may be, nevertheless, a way to focus in on pulling all the elements together. Because of course he's looking at timber supply modeling results, looking at disturbance, he's looking at all these factors. Also included scenarios of adaptation, so, options for adaptation. And so this notion that you could actually pull all these different elements together in a way that actually informs what's going on at this, not only national level, but regional level, is actually quite powerful. And one of the things he says is he needs to establish better links to the ecologist. So to be able to pull into these large-scale models, you need those better links. But I would also then argue that this then also gives you a link out to that international community, which seems to be, some of the data seems to be implying that we're sort of lacking. So this ability to be able to be, have results that are harmonized at that international level, that IPCC level, but also can speak to regional issues as well. So very, very interesting results all around. And in the end, of course, we had Dr. Nicole Plank, and in fact, did that presentation. It was a really, really interesting presentation where she was actually using, again, bibliometric methods, but in this instance, her partners, the people she was working with, were interested in what are the specific adaptations in the literature. So she had a sort of a very nice framework of pulling together and identifying actual concrete examples of, or suggestions of different specific adaptation options, which of course is a wealth of resource in a sense to be able to say, oh, what are some of the adaptations people are thinking about? So silviculturally, or in terms of resilience, or in terms of some of these other sort of factors. So it was a really, really powerful sort of thing. So from a policy perspective, it's like then becomes a question of, well, then how would you encourage some of these more successful adaptation options? But then Richard at the end is organizing this book, so these different chapters with Brian, and he started talking about and bringing us back to the policy question. And I think that was a great way to end off. So what are the major policy questions? And what can the feds do? Keeping in mind that, in fact, this whole process is being driven by informed federal policy. So federal policy is very different from provincial policy. So one of the things, if you're going from regional to national, you have to keep in mind the objectives of this study and then how we're related at a regional scale to this study. So in terms of some of the things that the feds can do, R&D, criteria and indicators for sustainable development, regional economic development, encouraging employment and skills, Aboriginal issues, infrastructure, invasive species, marketplace, health and safety. So these are sort of things that the federal government's interested in, and this analysis would inform that. So in an overall sense, that's sort of what's informing, and there's Richard and there's Dr. Plank. So, the idea of the workshop was, these were the presentations on the first day. And so what did we get out of that? Well, minimally, the workshop provided a forum for the mobilization, synthesis, and critique of national and regional scientific results. But tangentially, it just brought a lot of people together within the Atlantic region and let them know what's going on. Now, this is actually quite an interesting result because we did an analysis, sort of a mapping of experts within the Atlantic region to invite to this workshop. and who want to maintain, and not just in Canada, but in Maine as well, and in the States and the USDA and the Gulf of Maine Council, they're actually quite interested in what's going on at the federal level. They approach their forest management in an entirely different way. So they can often, we found that they can actually be quite impressed by some of the stuff we're doing at this high level, because they don't have the same sort of tools available to them, certainly not in the policy sense. They have different tools available, so they're actually quite interested. So the mapping was a way of, which we sort of preloaded this workshop, the mapping was a way of identifying those people who would be interested and who might be involved in a regional analysis. So this is, again, not just assuming you know who should be involved, but who's out there and what are they publishing on. And this is how we found out, certain key people. I found a colleague at UPEI who wasn't aware of her, and then it was like, oh, we have to talk to her, and certainly that was really quite useful. So we'll keep people informed in terms of that mapping. But more specifically, the workshop was instrumental in highlighting the dissonance between the various knowledge domains that are relevant to the forestry sector. And this is nothing new for forestry, for foresters, for forest research, forest sector researchers, for CFS. We've always been involved in this game of, there's the growth and yield modeling, there's the ecological modeling, there's the disturbance modeling. It's something that's been going on a long time, and I've argued to my colleagues outside the forestry profession, outside this sector, in my climate change work, that in fact, there's a lot of good ideas and a lot of good modeling approaches that are not being, integrated at some of those other scales within some of those other knowledge sectors and that sort of thing. So we found out that there is a dissonance, and in fact, it's really important to have the right people at the table. So during the second day, we'll go over this quickly. The second day of the workshop, the participants, here's the interesting thing. So day two, we got a lot of great discussion on day one. We have the videos in them. I've gone over them. It's really, really nice. I'll be talking to Jason Edwards, see if we can post the videos. And, I think that alone is a huge resolve. This whole process of moving between the regional and national, it was really, really telling about the complexity of what's going on, which models you choose, what data is available. There's a huge amount of rich information in there, and I've tried to give you an overview, and I'll document it and make it more readily available instead of just talking about it. But, the idea was then to go on to a second day. Now, I'd sort of preload this by saying that this has been a really interesting process for CFS. It's not sort of for me to say, but you got hints that, wow, this was hard. It's hard to actually bring all these elements together. And I actually had a workshop the day before our workshop, and so our 2 days of our workshop, and pulling all these different elements together. And we'll speak to that at the end. But during the second day of the workshop, there was a sense that there was a sense that we would sort of divide the groups based upon the hierarchy that we had from the day before. So we had those, 6 or 7 different chapters, and we would have key people sort of, migrate towards those things, and we'd have, the typical workshop format where you have a table and you have everyone that's interested in that, issue, and then off you go. In fact, what happened almost spontaneously is we had 3 sort of tables: climate, a table of biophysical, silvicultural, and ecological factors, and then a socioeconomic and timber supply policy considerations. So right off the bat, people sort of split up into those distinctions, and that in and of itself is interesting. But then when they were asked to look at the big questions, but then look at more specific methodology and detail questions and stuff like that. So, and this is one of those things where you start to realize, as a workshop should, what the real issues are. Defining the spatial scale of a regional assessment. So part of this is, well, if you're going to do a regional assessment, what is that? And, a simple response came from the climate people. Number one is the Atlantic region is totally different from the rest of Canada, and yes, it goes all the way up into Labrador. So we're being driven by what's going on in the ocean. And we hear this again and again and again. So if we're looking at increased storm occurrence, that's going to have a major impact on what's going on. So whom was the audience of the assessment, and who would undertake a regional assessment? So this became actually quite interesting. The specific questions were basically just sort of abandoned. We weren't talking about methods, and as we saw from the previous day, maybe those weren't good questions because there were lots of methods. There was a sense that the data of both GCMs and RCMs is readily available. Not necessarily been used in that way, but it's readily available. and this relationship between research input and output, that in fact those questions of detail were not the issues that were driving this second day. So in hindsight, it's not surprising, as I said, that people were more interested in the big questions. The most important big question was it even warranted to undertake a regional assessment? I think these are solid questions. Here the group showed the greatest divergence. So let's see what I said on the next one. Groups A and B clearly indicated that a regional assessment was not only possible, but that the Atlantic region represented an entirely unique climatic challenge. And they were actually incredibly forceful about this. Absolutely, you should do a regional assessment. So groups A and B, on the climate side, on the ecological side, not only is it important, but that there's already results, and it's incredibly important to do that right now. In contrast, Group C focused on the pivotal role of timber supply and the notion that the data for this analysis, the growth and yield modeling that Fenruy had talked about, was not yet available, and so the possibility for economic analysis, we didn't even talk about economic analysis, if I remember correctly. So these were really interesting results, And so it's abundantly clear that pieces of the puzzle were not. Some were there, and other pieces were not there. So a bottleneck that centered on timber supply, and this is despite really promising results from BC with the Carolyn Diamond. While the need for a regional forest assessment, so the need for a regional assessment, forest sector assessment, was never questioned, right across the board. But some people were saying, wait, we really don't have all the pieces yet. That was really, really interesting. So next steps, so I'll go through this quickly. We suggest an intermediate pathway that, it doesn't really matter what we call it, but on the one hand, there's a need for, we've already talked about the sort of fragmentation that occurs, and certainly it may even be more pronounced in the Atlantic region because we're looking at different provinces, and a lot of academic capacity, but that it's spread heterogeneously across the Atlantic region. So there would be a need to pull that together, but you could do that virtually. So a bricolage method would be, listen, we'll keep moving ahead on this, and we'll keep, you can do a lot, as we've sort of shown, without a lot of resources. The idea is just pulling people together versus an engineered approach that not only proactively identifies knowledge limitations and gaps, but seeks new resources, expertise, and methods to fill those gaps. So this is very proactive, and it requires a commitment across the different provinces. There was some indication that that might be the case, so we'll move forward on both fronts, and I think those are interesting results. So if we bring this back to that original knowledge specialization versus knowledge brokerage, there's this sense that right off from the very first sentence, if A doesn't even know B exists, then there's no way of moving forward. So this is one of the things that we've sort of found, that if we actually simply identify who B is, then that's been huge. So that just that alone will mean people will start doing more relevant research and tie it, but also that this is a purposeful thing. So on one hand, when you look at the analysis, in this case by Carnabuki and Brugman, they're talking about innovation. And innovation can be very, very isolated, but it can also be highly integrated, as we know. But in this case, we're looking at something that is an environmental issue. It's purpose-driven, i.e. what's going to happen to the forest sector in terms of climate change. And that you can start making these relationships happen. But the very first step is identifying who the players are. Now here's the big challenge. The challenge then, of course, is that you augment so you not only identify B right here, but that you actually identify a means that these different fields can talk to each other. Now the obvious answer there, of course, would be scenarios modeling. And of course, the international community has moved on. They're not only doing climate scenarios, but they're also looking at socioeconomic scenarios. And there's different methodologies and approaches that you can use to be able to look at some of these things. So in terms of assessments, national to regional, the answer seems to be that, and the literature, if you actually go into this document, which is actually a brilliant thing, and we'll try to sort of focus a publication on this for Forest Chronicle, but if you actually go into it, what they say is, yes, it's far easier to specialize, and it's far safer, it's far more risk adverse. That in fact you will get solid growth rates, but eventually those growth rates in terms of knowledge production or meeting your goal will drain off. And that in fact, if things have moved on, you have to engage in these knowledge brokerage exercises. So you have to do this. But guess what? It's incredibly hard to do. But the flip side is, once you've done it, the rewards are enormous. And I can't help but think that the rewards in terms of preparing not just the Atlantic region, but different regions across Canada for climate change, the rewards are absolutely enormous. that we've seen by some of these larger macro studies. So in fact, how we actually integrate between, the regional and the national, I think is a fundamental question that's still open. I think minimally, when the results of the national study come out, that finding out that, at least assessing how those results are then used and how they can be augmented at that regional scale, I think is something that certainly should be followed through on. So let me see if that's it. Probably the end. And anyway, we have a bunch of steps. We have a series of, quote, next steps. So we've moved ahead on tree species distribution. We're using some of the downscale data by Philippe Gachon, and this all came out of the workshop. So we're actually moving ahead. Dr. Bork is working on this. He actually has results right now. So we've actually used an RCM data set, an ensemble set, that is post-AR5. So the most up-to-date regional climate modeling is going into Dr. Bork's models. Of course, Van Lans is continuing on with the CGE modeling. He said that in his presentation. He's pulling in more and more different sectors, and in fact, this is actually brilliant. So he's doing this on his own. It has nothing to do with the regional assessment, but again, just keeping people informed of what's happening in terms of that. Not only, and here's a great example, not only regionally but nationally, these results are actually quite relevant. I think I just had that one. But we're also looking at one of the things, this whole storm track thing. So one of the things we got out of the workshop is, again, storms. And Philippe Gachon, again, actually has the ability to start to pull in some of the RCM data, the most recent RCM data we just talked about, to actually generate winds and wind speeds. And we'll be looking at, obviously, impacts in terms of that. This is with Charles, but I think also Sylvie Gauthier will be working with Philippe on this. I'm not sure if I should say that, but it seems to be that this is the natural next step. So again, regionally, we're just moving ahead. But we're also proposing some training modules for government employees in the context of using scenarios analysis. So, and using some of these models to be able to sort of simplified models. And this speaks to the discussions that happened around timber supply, but also not just timber supply, but we're looking at some cost-benefit stuff that's out there. So just to be able to familiarize government employees, train government employees in the context of using climate scenarios in an actual predictive model so that they can get a familiarity with that and what that means. So this is something we'll be moving ahead on as well. So this is the bricolage approach. But we'll also be moving forward with trying to pull together a sort of coherent approach. And it sort of makes sense to do this after the results of the national study and see what do we do with this and where do we go with it? And can we actually augment this and then make a fuller and larger picture? So the last thing I would say is that we're going to put all this stuff, now that we've pulled this thing together, we're going to put it all online, and we'll be talking to our colleagues about that. So thank you very much. That was a lot, and thank you very much, Annette.
Okay, well, great. Thanks so much, Jim. So I know we've gone a little bit over our time, but if there are any questions, we'll see if we can get them answered now. So if anybody does have questions or comments for Jim on his presentation, now is the time to ask. So again, if you'd like to use the chat box, please feel free to go ahead and type out your question, and I can read it out loud for everybody. And if you're on the conference call line with us and would prefer to ask a question over the telephone, all you have to do is hit *6 to unmute your line. So I don't see that anybody's typing just yet. There's a lot of information to take in. Is there anybody on the conference call line that would like to ask a question or a comment? If not, I just wanted to ask you, Jim, so the workshop, you said there was videos from that. Is that something that we can post on the FACOP for people to
Oh, that'd be great. I'll obviously have to talk to those involved.
Okay.
But I think, yeah, I mean, I was a little bit worried because our previous video hadn't worked out really well. But we actually have good sound quality on this, so it's something I'll obviously be talking to our colleagues about and seeing if that's okay. And I think that'd be a great place to post.
Perfect. I'm sure people will be interested in that. So, any other questions, comments? I see somebody's typing, so we may just give it a couple of seconds here before we move on. So Karen just says, thanks for all your nice compliments on our study.
Oh, it was just a great study. I think it's just one of the highlights because it's just so dramatically, and from being a little more academic, this whole notion of using this sort of counterfactual process where you reinvent history, I think is absolutely brilliant. Like, could we have? And I think that's the great thing about the scenario analysis. You can actually bounce back and forth between some of these sort of ideas. Like, how would we have been able to respond to Mountain Pine Beetle? So, Karen, I'm just a big fan.
Great. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up? And then, Jim, do you have your email address? And if so, are people able to contact you if they have any questions after the
Yeah,
webinar?
they can get me at UNB, of course. Can I put that online?
Yeah, you can just type it in, or just tell me what it is, and I can type it in here.
Yeah, I hit my keyboard, and actually it seems to have worked well because I had some problems last time I did this.
Okay, perfect. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I guess we'll wrap things up. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. Obviously, very big thank you goes out to you, Jim, for your time and effort and for a great and informative presentation. And your email address is up for anybody wanting to contact you with further questions.
Yeah, and I'd like to again thank Jason Edwards, Brian Eddy, and Richard Parfait. So it's been incredibly supportive, and I certainly love to have done this with them. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Jim, and thanks everybody for joining. And I guess we'll wrap things up now. So